Welcome to Chapter 4 on our Preventive Controls for Animal Food course. In this chapter, we are going to be going over the actual food safety plan itself, so the actual document that's going to be produced by being in compliance with Part 507. So far in the chapters, we've covered kind of the overview of the regulations, some of the exemptions. We talked about the record keeping section in subpart F, so keep all of that in mind while we're talking about this document. We also spent chapter 2 looking at the CGMP program. Keep in mind that that CGMP program or any other prerequisite programs that you already have in place or any SOP programs, those operate and live outside of the food safety plan. There are going to be some aspects of them that will support the food safety plan, and there will be some decisions made in the food safety plan that will reference some of those programs or be dependent on some of those programs, but they are separate documents. Okay, so keep that in mind. This is a separate living entity. We also then spent chapter 3 looking at some of the hazards that might be known or reasonably foreseeable within our facility or given our intended species. So where we're going in chapter 4 is we're going to look at the structure of the actual food safety plan as a document, and then from there we're going to explore more about how we can document how we control hazards and some decision-making processes that happen down the line. So in order to document all that, we need to know what that document looks like, which is the food safety plan. So we have our chapter objectives here. We are going to be looking at the required elements in the food safety plan. We are also going to be, I'm going to have some suggestions for some things that are not required, but I think you may want to include anyways in your food safety plan, some suggested components, I suppose. So we'll talk about all of those components, and then we're also going to talk about the principles that are applied to build a food safety plan. So I told you at the beginning that we're not going to build a food safety plan for your facility, but we are going to talk about the principles and kind of some of the skills and some of the knowledge that you're going to need to actually write this document out. And then we're also going to go over the reanalysis section of the regulation and talk about when you're going to need to revise or at least revisit this food safety plan as a whole. This graphic right here is meant to represent what the purpose of the food safety plan is. So we spent chapter 3 talking about sources of hazards and kind of how hazards can get into our final product, including things like the environment, the equipment, the ingredients, the people, and the process design itself. And now where we're going from there is we're going to talk about how to mitigate those hazards. So I guess we already did talk about the CGMP program. That's going to be our kind of foundation for controlling most of the hazards that we have in our facility. If we have some hazards that are particularly high risk, then we are going to implement preventive controls. Okay, don't worry about that just yet. We're getting there. But the food safety plan kind of lives in between these two worlds right here. So we take all of the ways that hazards can possibly get into our product and we bring that together with all of the ways that we mitigate that and how we prevent it from getting into our product, and we write it down in our food safety plan. Okay, so here's the first piece of regulation that we see on the food safety plan itself. This is 507.3.1, and what it says is you must prepare or have prepared and implement a written food safety plan. Okay, so if you're subject to subpart C, you need to have a food safety plan. Everyone will have a food safety plan. Some food safety plans are going to look different or have some different components to them, but everyone will have one if you're subject to subpart C. Also, here's some language on a PCQI. So preventive controls, qualified individuals must prepare or oversee the preparation of the food safety plan. Remember, that was number 1 on our list of duties for the PCQI. So this food safety plan is their responsibility. It should be their little baby that they are writing this down and getting all of this information put together. Just a reminder that we are in subpart C now, so this term "you," if you look up the term "you" in 507.3, the definitions section, the definition actually says the owner, operator, or agent in charge. Remember that owner, operator, agent in charge is in charge of subpart C, and the management was in charge of subpart B. Okay. Now, the preventive controls is going to be doing a lot of legwork for both of those entities, but within the language of the law, this is what it says that you, the owner, operator, agent in charge, should be overseeing the Subpart C and making sure that everyone that's involved in Subpart C is trained to do their job and that this food safety plan is written correctly. And that they have to sign it. Remember, they have to sign it upon completion and any revision. Okay, so the written food safety plan must include the following things. So these are your required components of your food safety plan. You have to have a hazard analysis. Everyone will have a hazard analysis. You have to tell me about the preventive controls that you are going to implement. And I'm going to tell you right now, and I'll tell you again in the next few chapters, that not every company is going to have preventive controls. I've worked with many companies, mostly livestock facilities or some ingredient manufacturers that simply don't have preventive controls. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can kind of justify that and work within the framework of the regulation for that to still be okay. But just so you know, not everyone will have those preventive controls. If you're working in a pet food facility, you're probably going to have preventive controls. It's a little higher risk situation. So anyway, so everyone will have a hazard analysis. Some companies will have preventive controls that they're going to describe. Some companies will choose to have a supply chain control that they'll want to describe. There's also a recall plan component to the food safety plan, and we'll talk about those requirements in just a little bit. Written procedures for monitoring the implementation of preventive controls, written corrective action procedures, and written verification procedures. Those 3 bullet points are what I refer to as our management components of our preventive controls. So you're only going to have those components if you do have a preventive control. And these are the things that we're going to cover in detail in Chapter 6 and then explore a little bit more in Chapters 7, 8, and 9. All right. Remember that the food safety plan is subject to the record keeping section of the regulation, which is subpart F. And in your student manual, there is a little box, a little sidebar box that has some more reminders about some of the requirements in subpart F. Okay, this is meant to break down that part of the regulation into a little bit more visually pleasing layout here. So on the left-hand side, we have required components. On the other side, on the right-hand side, we have other useful, highly suggested components. So let's look at the required components first, since we were just talking about those. Number 1, hazard analysis. Everyone has a hazard analysis. The next bullet point was the preventive controls, and these are kind of our options for preventive controls. And again, we'll explore these a lot more later, but these are our options for different categories of preventive controls. And you'll notice that this section has a red asterisk next to it. Well, right down here, it says this is only required if your hazard analysis says you need a preventive control, which makes sense. If you go through the hazard analysis and decide you don't need a preventive control, you're not going to need to do all of these things right here, right? But if you do have a preventive control, you're going to need to tell us what it is. You're also going to need to tell us what your management components look like. So how are you going to monitor it? How are you going to do corrective actions? What does your verification process look like? And then you're also going to have a recall plan. Yes, that is correct. You only have to have a recall plan if you have a preventive control. That said, I think literally every regulator is going to ask you to have a recall plan anyways on every product. Okay. In Chapter 10, we'll tackle the recall plans and talk about some of the required components and some of the intentions behind recall plans. The language of the law says they're only required if you have a preventive control, but I'm going to suggest, and I think every regulator you talk to will suggest to have one anyways. Some of the reasoning behind why it was only required with preventive controls is because essentially the legislators thought that we didn't have enough teeth, enough enough ground to work with to require them on things that don't have a preventive control. Remember that the preventive controls are put in place for particularly high risk situations. So if you don't have a particularly high risk situation, there's kind of no legal ground to say you have to have a plan in place for when something goes wrong. Okay, that said, still do it, okay? We'll get there in chapter 10. Have a recall plan. In the back of your student manual, there's actually a pretty good example of a recall plan. It's not totally fleshed out, but there are some good templates back there to help you get started. Okay, back to it. So we have the hazard analysis for sure, the preventive controls maybe, and a reanalysis is required, and implementation records are required as well for everybody. Okay, other useful components. Basically, this is all just kind of goes into this category of like background information. And this is really the piece where we try to facilitate communication. So the first one's going to be a food safety team list, a facility overview, and a flow diagram. And we're going to talk about and look at examples of all of those in just a second. So I won't talk too much about them just now, but I do want to touch on this idea right here. So I already mentioned that there's a big advantage here of increasing and facilitating the communication. Some disadvantages, though, could be that remember that this document is something that could be released to the public if FDA ever deemed that necessary. I have been reassured by FDA employees that any information that needed to be redacted would be redacted before release, but it's just something to keep in mind to protect ourselves as business owners. Okay, let's look at some examples here. Actually, before I do that, let me remind you guys of this right here. So this was 507.206, where we talked about, which is a record keeping section. And just a reminder that the owner, operator, or agent in charge has to sign your food safety plan upon completion and any modification. Okay, so that's physical signature or digital signature as long as that's secure. They actually need to sign this. So make sure that person that you're deeming your owner, operator, or agent in charge is capable of doing this record keeping aspect. Okay, so as we go through this food safety plan, our example is going to be this kind of 3-ring binder format that we have over here. Your format of your food safety plan is totally flexible as long as you have the required components. So I've seen food safety plans that are all of these components in one long Word document. I've seen others that are separate Word files within the same folder. So it's totally up to you. I would suggest working with what you already have in place for your food safety system, and so your employees don't have to totally change what they're looking at and get used to something completely new. Work with what you already have. Work with what is going to help your employees be able to use this information. Okay, but this is our 3-ring binder that we're going to use as an example, and each of these tabs is going to be one of those bullet points that I just went over. So we're going to start at the optional information of kind of giving some background of your facility. Again, this is not required, but I think it does a really nice job of facilitating communication. So the first thing, so this is actually the first part of the example food safety plan that we've looked at. This is ABC Feed Mill. This is our livestock example. And this right here is a list of their food safety team members. I think the FSPCA was really creative in the names that they came up with here. I don't know if you can feel the sarcasm through that through my voice, but these are pretty funny. So IR Charge is a plant manager, FS Leader is a production supervisor, IM Quality is a quality supervisor, and IM Fixer is the maintenance supervisor. Okay, a couple things I do like about this list. Number one, they've got an asterisk here indicating who is going to be their PCQI. So I know they have a PCQI. I know who to talk to about the food safety plan. Great. The other thing I like is that all of these titles are from various parts of the facility. So it's not just the quality people that are involved here. Maintenance supervisor, yeah, of course the maintenance supervisor needs to be involved if anything goes wrong with the equipment, any of the calibration that we have to do. that all has to come into account in this food safety plan. So this is a holistic group of people. I also appreciate that these people probably have different perspectives on um, risk tolerance, and having those different perspectives and those different points of views on your food safety team can really make sure that you're getting all of the corners covered and making sure it's actually a comprehensive food safety plan. Okay. Other people I've seen on this list could include like lawyers or even insurance agents. Insurance agents have been known to ask to look at food safety plans to see if you're in compliance with Part 507, so that's something to be aware of. But I think making sure that this group of people is diverse and comprehensive is the take-home message. You do not have to put actual people's names on this list. You can just put titles. I would also recommend indicating who your management or owner, operator, agent in charge is on this list so we know who those titles belong to. Okay, so first optional thing, list of your food safety team members. Second optional thing is going to be a facility overview. So this is meant to just be a narrative of what's going on in your facility to help an investigator or help your customer kind of see the picture of what's going on in your facility. So what kind of products you're making. It can help identify any particular hazards that you're bringing in to the facility or may end up in your final product. Um, so for example, most investigators, when they come into the facility, their brain will automatically start, or even their hand will automatically start creating a list of hazards that they think are known or reasonably foreseeable within your facility. And so instead of them sitting down and asking you 150 questions to get that list, you can give them this one sheet of paper with this information on it, and that will help them start to create their list of known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. The next step from there is they're going to compare that list to the list that you make in your food safety plan. And we'll get there in just a little bit when we get into chapter 5, but you are also going to have a list of known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. And so this investigator can compare the two and see if there's any discrepancies between them. Okay, so facility overview can include things like just a description of the facility itself, how much feed you're making, product description. This helps identify the intended species, which can be really helpful for that known or reasonably foreseeable hazard list. Intended uses and any animal drugs. So I can see right here we have monensin. Ooh, red flag coming up, right? Okay, so that can help just kind of facilitate that communication once again. Next optional piece could be a flow diagram. If you already have a HACCP plan in place, you probably already have a flow diagram built. On the HACCP flow diagrams, it's required that you identify your critical control points. Critical control points, this is your spoiler alert for this chapter, critical control points are pretty much the same thing as preventive controls, okay? We're going to categorize things a little bit differently. There's some different language associated with them, but the idea is that you've identified a spot in your facility where there's a high risk hazard and you have a process or two that is going to control it. That's your critical control point. That is also your preventive control. So on your flow diagram that's in your food safety plan, I would also suggest you identify where your preventive controls are at. So maybe like right here, mixing can be a preventive control. So I'm just going to identify that in a different color or at least label it as preventive control number 3, for example. Okay. The other thing I like to say on these flow diagrams is that it's okay to have a flow diagram in your food safety plan that is different than the flow diagram you are using with your employees or different than a flow diagram you're using with a different team within your facility. So you can kind of tailor this flow diagram to show the things you need to show associated with your food safety plan. All right, so keep that in mind. Have some flexibility there. The hazard analysis section is the first required section of the food safety plan. So everyone will have a hazard analysis. And this is probably the most important part of the food safety plan. This is the section where we are going to make our list of known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. We're going to decide whether we need preventive controls and kind of do some initial identification of them. And we'll do a whole bunch of justification. Okay, justification is absolutely essential when it comes to this regulation. We saw in the the GMP program, there was a lot of language that was as adequate and as necessary, which provides a lot of flexibility to companies. But that also means that they have to do their due diligence in providing justification and evidence for their decision making. And that's what this is all about. This hazard analysis, if you've ever done a risk assessment, this is essentially the same thing. So this is just kind of a different term for a risk assessment, a hazard analysis. And we'll go through all of that process in chapter 5 and a little bit in chapter 6. The next section is all about your preventive controls. So if you do your hazard analysis and you decide you need a preventive control, you're going to describe it to us in the next couple of sections. We have a few different categories of preventive controls that we're going to be learning about and that are outlined in this regulation. The first one is a process control. This process control is essentially any manufacturing process that you're doing that helps you control a hazard. So a lot of critical control points that we see in HACCP plans are going to be process controls. Anything like mixing, extruding, pelleting, any magnets, any of that kind of stuff is a process control. A sanitation control is going to be targeted at biological hazards, those microorganisms, and that's going to look like maybe doing some sanitation of food contact surfaces, or even like hygienic zoning could be a sanitation control. And then we also have supply chain control. A supply chain control is a situation where you ask your supplier to control a hazard before it gets to your door. So it's applied in the supplier building. They're controlling that hazard for you before it gets to your door. Okay, and we're going to explore all of these in a lot more detail later on, so don't worry yet. That's just kind of your first introduction to those different categories. All right, if we do have preventive controls, we're going to describe them. We're also going to describe their management components. The three categories of management components are monitoring, corrective actions and corrections, and verification. Okay, so we're going to describe all of that in this section and kind of showing how we are mitigating that hazard that needs a preventive control. We are also going to have a recall plan. Again, only required if you have a preventive control, but highly suggested otherwise. Chapter 10 is where we cover the recall plan and what you're required to do in a recall plan. These 4 bullet points kind of summarize it nicely. Direct notification of customers, notification of the public, conducting effectiveness checks and what that looks like, and then appropriate disposal of the recalled animal food. That's the recall plan in very short summarized bullet points. The last section we're going to have is an implementation records section. Now this is important. This is meant to be a bank of templates of records that you're going to be using in association with your food safety system. So it's not meant to be the place where you shove all of your monitoring records that are produced every single day. This is just a place where you have a template of your monitoring record for preventive control number 2. Okay? So your template bank should be here. You will also want a template of your training records. Remember that when I first introduced the idea of a qualified individual, this is kind of anyone in the facility that's helping manufacture animal food, or holding, processing, manufacturing, any of those activities. And those people need to be, number 1, trained to do their job, but number 2, trained in animal food hygiene. And you have to keep those hygiene records on hand for 2 years. Okay, so this would be a good place to put a piece of paper that acts as a template for what that hygiene training looks like, or maybe even just describes how you record those trainings and how those records are kept. Okay, other documents that are going to be found in here besides the monitoring and training could be things like anything related to your validation or your verification activities, any calibration schedules or procedures, any product testing schedules or procedures, and any records review schedules or procedures. Okay, so preventive controls are going to require a lot of documentation. I kind of think of preventive controls as CGMPs with more paperwork. Okay, we have those particularly high risk situations that we're going to put preventive controls on, which means we need to keep a closer eye on them, which means they're going to produce more paperwork. So if you have a preventive control, this section of your food safety plan might be quite a bit bigger than if you don't. Okay, so those are the sections of the food safety plan itself as a living, breathing document. Remember to tailor it to whatever works for your facility. And now I want to talk about when we need to reanalyze or revisit this food safety plan. Here is 507.50 reanalysis. So this is actually subpart C again as well, kind of jumping around a little bit here, but here's your take-home message. You need to reanalyze your food safety plan at least every 3 years. Most companies that I've talked to are just kind of making a good business decision of doing this annually. So once a year, they're going to reanalyze their food safety plan. But the regulation says at least every 3 years or as necessary. I kind of think of this section here as necessary. So what it says is whenever there's a significant change in the activities conducted at your facility, whenever you become aware of new information, whenever there's an unanticipated animal food safety problem, or you find something it just isn't working. If you have a preventive control that is ineffective, it's time to do a reanalysis. Okay, we're going to spend some time talking about corrective actions and corrections a little bit later on. And if you're having to do those over and over again, that might be a situation where you need to do a reanalysis. I want to clarify though that the reanalysis process really just needs to look like a meeting with your food safety team where you review your food safety plan and make sure it's still working and make sure it's still valid. You do not have to change anything in those meetings, but it should be a time where you can have a discussion to decide whether something does need to change. Okay, so in your food safety plan, I also recommend having a log of your reanalysis meetings and a little narrative about any decisions that were made in those reanalysis meetings. So you can document that this is happening at least every 3 years. Okay, if you are going to change something in your facility or you know something's coming down the pipeline that might prompt a reanalysis, we are recommending, or FDA is recommending, that you do the reanalysis before you start implementing those changes. So if you know you're getting a new piece of equipment, for example, you should do the reanalysis process, do the validation process, all of those steps that we do in implementing a preventive control or even just any part of the food safety system before you actually start manufacturing feed with that process. And I think that makes sense. It's a good business practice. You know, if I was going to implement something new in my facility, I would want to do the legwork and the research beforehand to make sure that it's going to operate as I want it to and as I need it to. So make sure you're doing the reanalysis and incorporating that new system into your food safety plan before you actually start using it. Or there's a little bit of a leeway here built into the regulation. You can do it within 90 calendar days or within a reasonable time frame as long as the PCQI oversees the preparation of a written justification for a time frame outside of 90 days. So there's going to be some activities, particularly I'm thinking about like validation, where you're going to have to start manufacturing feed to test that feed and make sure that that control works. So that's kind of why this part was built in here, to give you a little bit of leeway to do that. So ideally before you start using it or within 90 days or when you can, as long as you justify it. Okay. Um, You also need to revise the food safety plan whenever that reanalysis meeting indicates that you should revise it. So if you have this meeting, you've identified some changes that need to be made, go ahead and make those changes. All right, PCQI has to oversee this reanalysis. That makes sense. And you must conduct a reanalysis of the food safety plan when FDA determines it necessary to respond to new hazards and developments in scientific understanding. So there are definitely some hazards out there that we don't know about yet, or there are some instances of intentional adulteration that we can't foresee. So anytime FDA says, hey, this is a new thing, please do a reanalysis and incorporate it into your food safety plan, make sure to do that. Okay, so to summarize reanalysis here, the big idea is a food safety system changes with time. This is a dynamic thing that should be able to shift given any future changes. We are doing the legwork right now to write these food safety plans. But the idea is that they're going to be used for years after we're gone as our foundation. So make sure that there's a plan set up to help them change as needed. Periodic reanalysis is needed to verify that the whole system works, and it's required at least every 3 years or as necessary. Okay, let's summarize that entire chapter here. So remember, the food safety plan is absolutely required to have a hazard analysis and a record keeping section. All right, you're at least going to have training records built in there. You're definitely going to have at least both of those. Some of you will also have a preventive controls section where you describe the preventive control and their management components, and a recall plan. The format's flexible, make sure it meets the needs of your employees, and you need to do reanalysis every 3 years or as necessary. This is the exercise that would normally be incorporated into the in-person version of this class. So again, as usual, just kind of take a peek at these questions, think through them, do some reflection on what you've already got going on in your facility, and see where some holes might be if you have any. There will be some language like this built into the assignment associated with this chapter. Okay, and to summarize all of that and that exercise, the format of the food safety plan is flexible. Describing the individuals involved, the facility, and the type of animal food is helpful for communicating with employees, customers, and regulators. So this is referencing all of those optional sections that I think are a good idea to have in your food safety plan. There are some required components of the food safety plan, and many facilities are already conducting some of these activities. This is going to be an important message going forward. I think it's really important for people to recognize that there's already a lot of good stuff going on out there. Like, we are already doing a lot of things to protect our product. And now all we really need to do is take those things and organize them on a piece of paper and put the right language behind them and put them in the right places to show that we are doing those things and that we are in compliance with this Part 507. Okay? So start getting that mindset in place for thinking about what you've already got going on and how you can fit it within the boxes of this regulation. The last thing I want to say before I end this chapter, we'll address this optional section one more time. When we get to chapter 5, we're going to talk about building some rubrics that are going to help us make decisions in our hazard analysis. And a lot of facilities that I've worked with have decided to incorporate these rubrics into the front of their food safety plan in this kind of optional section to support that communication piece. So just one more thing that you might want to put up front in your food safety plan. But for now, we'll put a pin in that idea until we get into chapter 5.